Buddy? Oh, it's not yet. Is it on now? Yeah. So, hello everybody. I think a few are still returning with their coffees, their teas, their fruit juices, and whatever you've taken. Softer, louder? Okay, yeah. So also hello to those of you who are joined via WebEx. The people in on the technical wing in this room are monitoring any questions that you will send, either by chat or by just typing in the chat that you have a question. Once again, for those who don't want to be on the video or who don't want to be on the video on this particular day, you can be sitting on the right side of the room. This is a rather long panel that we have. I mean, what remains of the 90 minutes that we have for 5 papers is not a lot of time, which is why also Stefan Klingewiel and I are jointly leading this session. You need 4 hands maybe. So I'm going to pass on to him right away now. Yeah, what is there else to say? So we don't all fit on the podium, so a few of the paper presenters are actually in the room with you and will be coming up later in the session. But thanks a lot for coming to the biggest room in which I've ever done a paper session.
Great. Yeah, welcome to our panel session. That's great. Niels and I and me, we will do it jointly, and just few hopefully ice-breaking remarks at the beginning of this, I think important conference on effectiveness of development cooperation. So my ice-breaking remarks at the beginning. First of all, I think development effectiveness, aid effectiveness, very classical, very traditional topics. Going to the core question, does aid work, as we all know? We had a high time on aid and development effectiveness, starting with the Paris high-level meeting in 2005 with the 5 principles. We had the Accra meeting in 2008, and of course the Busan meeting in 2011, a bit the bridge between the OECD DAC aid effectiveness working group to the GPDC, which was created in 2012. I would regard this as the high time of aid and development effectiveness. Now, and this is also part of the title of our panel, we consider the phase we are living in now as the post-aid effectiveness era. What are main features of this post-aid effectiveness era? I think, first of all, a time where much more national interests of donors or development partners, I think Deb mentioned that the donor term might be not appropriate, so we can also use the development partner term, but that those national interests are much more prominent. Also a bit in the sense of this Southernization of ODA, that a number of ODA providers are using this kind of mutual benefit approach, which is also used by South-South cooperation providers. So national interests are much more prominent. We have the implications of the geopolitical context. We see it right now because of the Russian aggression in the Ukraine, but of course also the relationship between the West and most prominently the US and China, with a number of implications in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. And last but not least, sometimes a bit overlooked, but very significant trend, the overlap between ODA resources and international climate finance. This is a topic I was focusing a bit over the last couple of months, and I think this is, together with the geostrategic aspect, probably the main driving factor for ODA. And all this has implications on aid and development effectiveness topics. So this is a bit what I wanted to say at the beginning, that we have this great opportunity to reflect on aid and development effectiveness in a way dynamic context. We have a number of great papers, and we just jump in with the first great paper prepared by Lisa and Jonas and a couple of other colleagues. So maybe you just go ahead and I will push you after 10 minutes away from the podium. Thank you.
So thank you, Stefan and Niels, for the introduction. Jonas and I will present the paper Modalities of Knowledge Interactions in International Cooperation and Analysis of Selected Knowledge Actors, and I'll dive right into it. Knowledge is part of our everyday life and determines our ways of interactions. So whether we would like to gain more knowledge, for example, by reading the news, whether we want to share knowledge by talking to a colleague about our latest work project, or whether we want to exchange knowledge. And international development cooperation is also shaped by knowledge interactions. And in fact, they are highly important to address local, national, regional, and global challenges. And not at least the COVID-19 pandemic has shown how relevant knowledge interactions are for successful COVID management and to quickly adapt to emerging crises. But knowledge and development is also a known topic. Knowledge cooperation has often been framed as technical assistance or capacity development in the framework of ODA. But knowledge cooperation also attracted much more attention with the rise of South cooperation. And with South cooperation that uses knowledge cooperation as a central tool, there has also been much more attention or a greater emphasis on horizontal and demand-driven partnerships. And while this rhetoric shift can be regarded as a positive development towards more equal power dynamics and international cooperation as such, we also see that methods to achieve more horizontal cooperation have not been incorporated largely enough, and the toolboxes largely remain the same. This is also why partners from the Global South are often not convinced that knowledge cooperation in the context of ODA is the most effective and that there's much to learn from Southern organizations. At the same time, the empirical evidence on knowledge cooperation is quite scattered because the term or the concept of knowledge cooperation doesn't have a common understanding or a common concept. This is why in our research, we looked at how different forms of knowledge cooperation function, the toolboxes of knowledge cooperation, we analyzed power structures and learning dynamics, and eventually how knowledge cooperation can be effective. And to approach this, we followed an explorative and collaborative research design with 4 different partner organizations, which you can see in the bottom here. The first one being Rwanda Cooperation, which is one of the few South institutions on the African continent that offers Southern Triangular Cooperation. The second one being RIS, Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, an Indian think tank that takes a leading role in shaping the discourse on and implementing Southern Triangular Cooperation. We also collaborated with the UNDP Seoul Policy Center, one of UNDP's policy centers, with a focus on fostering knowledge exchange on policy solutions by drawing on the South Korean example. And lastly, we collaborated with GIZ, the German development agency focused on technical cooperation, and we worked with them both in India and in Rwanda. And then I'm handing over to Jonas.
Yes, it is impossible to conclusively define what knowledge actually encompasses. However, we argue, looking at knowledge interactions from a perspective of the asymmetrical power relations shaping them, helps to better understand how knowledge interaction between people take place and how they influence people's lives, especially in the sphere of development cooperation. For us, knowledge interactions describe interaction processes in which knowledge is shaped and communicated. We distinguish between knowledge interactions as transfer process and as exchange. Here on the slide, you can see both types simplified on a theoretical scale. Knowledge transfer is unidirectional from senders to receivers, and this has significant implications for power structures. Knowledge exchange is bi- or multidirectional based on mutuality. In the theoretical ideal, it is based on equality with ownership and possibilities of participation distributed evenly among all actors involved. Knowledge interactions can also be conceptualized more fluid as co-creative processes. Here, knowledge is formed iteratively and collaboratively between a diverse configuration of actors and expertise through the interaction with each other. To analyze this huge variety, methodologically, we followed a collaborative research design to create and validate case-by-case evidence with our partners. We interviewed 59 people, analyzed recordings of e-consultations and workshops, conducted participant observations in various forms, went on analytical field trips, and conducted also a survey with 39 participants of Rwanda cooperation formats. In addition, we collaboratively held 9 validation workshops. On these pictures here, you can see impressions from our data collection and validation process as part of the postgrad research program at IDOS, the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. Our group of 7 did fieldwork connected to South Korea and Germany, as well as physically in India and Rwanda. From all these insights, and based also on the existing literature as well as on our iterative discussions with our partners, we systematized our findings, and we can now contribute a mapping of modalities of knowledge interactions. Here on the slide, you can see our typology in this tree structure. Modalities of knowledge interactions are the forms of cooperation between partners in which knowledge plays the central role, and they consist of a meta modality at the top, modality functions, formats, and activities. The meta modality in our research focus is knowledge cooperation. Modality functions can be, for example, capacity development, policy advisory, or networking. And considering all our empirical cases, these 3 modality functions were the most prominent. Modality formats can be study visits, training programs, or working groups. These are the 3 modality formats our partners use the most. And modality activities can then be demo events, informal meetings, ad hoc consultancy, and many, many more. This typology here compiles all the modality functions, formats, and activities that we have identified in our empirical analysis. Beyond a narrow modality concept itself, we included also context modalities. You can see them at the very top of this slide. And this is something like an additional layer in the typology to highlight that all these modalities can be realized in the scope of South-South cooperation, ODA, and also triangular or trilateral cooperation.
As we have highlighted, we were also interested in exploring the effectiveness of knowledge cooperation, and we have developed the following 4 effectiveness dimensions: ownership, relationship dynamics, innovation and co-creation, and sustainability. And the criteria are based on a literature review and through the collaboration with our partners. So in workshops like these, we could expand the understanding of effectiveness in knowledge cooperation, and additionally we aimed at creating learning spaces with our partners to discuss those dimensions, their meanings, and how to indicate them. Eventually we analyzed whether the knowledge cooperation of our partners are effective in the sense of those 4 dimensions, and I will highlight some of the aspects. So when we look at ownership, all of our partners want to act demand-driven and allow for shared ownership, but ownership is not always sensed or experienced by all partners, and creating spaces for ownership demands for trust and also taking into account the several facets of ownership. In regard to relationship dynamics, it can be said that most of our partner organizations claim to foster knowledge exchange, for example in a marketing material, but in fact knowledge transfer remains predominant. And a pure form of knowledge exchange where power relations are minimized often remains a vision. When we look at innovation and co-creation, it can be said that, Okay, it keeps jumping, I'm sorry. So when we look at innovation and co-creation, we can say that innovations can evolve from those knowledge interactions if suitable learning and co-creation spaces are established. However, innovations are hard to track or sometimes not tracked at all because they go beyond the project logic. So often innovations happen after an interaction has taken place and therefore they are not part of the impact evaluation. And lastly, we looked at sustainability of knowledge cooperation in the sense of its adaptability, long-lasting effects, and continued partnerships. And there it can be stated that adaptability is highly important, particularly due to COVID-19. Our partners had to adapt to online formats, for example, and discovering differentiated interaction formats. And moreover, we discovered that follow-ups are the key for continuity and upscaling. So if we'd like to recap, in our research, we considered that knowledge cooperation is regarded as an important tool, but we wanted to understand better what it is, how it functions, and how effective it is. And therefore, we focused on mapping modalities in knowledge cooperation and on developing effectiveness dimension. And in the future, we would like to address you or us as scientific community to continue reflecting upon and developing those dimensions, and would welcome further learning spaces to sharpen the understanding of knowledge cooperation by bringing actors from the global south and north together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Jonas, for your presentation. The next paper presentation on a paper jointly drafted by Svea Koch, Ina Friesen, and Nils Kaiser on stronger cooperation in EU development policy under Team Europe. And one co-author is around, that's Nils. So Nils, over to you, 10 minutes.
So let's see how I'm going to work with the remote control that appears to be remotely controlled. We sent some slides ahead of today, so I think they can be brought on screen in a minute. In the meantime, I can really tell you what the paper is about. Oh, there's the title over there. I'm indeed the co-author, the actual lead author, the spiritual leader of this paper, my colleague Svea Koch, who once defended her PhD with somebody in the room here. Is remotely connected and might come in later for the Q&A, but I'm going to present it today. And our paper is about Team Europe and basically looks into whether Team Europe can be an aid effectiveness agenda for the European Union, in a nutshell. Team Europe is a pleonasm, of course. Europe already implies being a team. It's a bit like white snow or rainy Brussels, but that's a term that we are working with here, Team Europe, and that term, wonder if the slides are there. I'm just going to talk otherwise. Oh, okay, I have to press it. Okay, then, yeah, there they are. And as you can see, actually, many of these slides have the same template. That's because we all work at the same organization in Bonn, which is called the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. So, let's see, I have to press it firmly. Yeah. So, the EU's development policy since the last decade or so has been frequently confronted by crisis and had to do something about those crises. The financial crisis, the migration crisis, the climate crisis, currently Ukraine-related crises in plural, but also in 2020, the pandemic. And earlier in that past decade of ours, typically the member states were welcome with the EU using its considerable budget to do something about this crisis, but it never really led to a discussion, should we, as EU and member states, organize ourselves differently? Should we move away from this idea that we have rather separate development cooperation lives, European and bilateral, and should we rather not work together as a team? And our paper basically tries to do two things. It describes what happened under Team Europe, what the ambition may have been. It's a moving target in a certain way, just like this presentation. Let me see if I can get it back. Otherwise, I mean, it will make me move ahead in time anyway. But what we try to see, does Team Europe constitute a critical juncture for the EU's development policy? Does this actually inspire a different way of working together? And has this crisis actually been an opportunity for the EU's development policy? Now, having a critical juncture doesn't mean theoretically that you take it. So sometimes a critical juncture opens as a window of opportunity for institutional change of otherwise rather path-dependent structures. Sometimes that leads to change, and often it doesn't. And for Team Europe, it's still out, as we will show in the descriptive parts here. But before we do, we define in the paper some factors that might explain why institutional change might occur or not. And basically that was a combination of, yeah, there you are, policy entrepreneurship, politicization, the amount thereof. Yep. This is a small reflective pause for you. Why don't we go here? This is basically what happened to Team Europe. There's been a first phase of Team Europe where the EU was in a kind of defensive mode. It was seeing that China was responding faster and in a more visible manner than the EU was at that time. And it responded by bringing together resources in the form of a table, in the form of political statements, and showing here we are as the EU doing something together. But basically it was a table summing up what everybody was doing and what could be changed. It was a difficult moment for the EU too. It was the end of a financial cycle, the 7-year cycle, which means they didn't have much flexible means at their disposal. But interestingly, it led to a very positive response from member states. They were really into it, and they were joining WebEx meetings with hundreds of people trying to put together these Team Europe initiatives that were alluded to. But what happened basically during that year, during 2020, is that it moved from a what agenda, basically showing the EU was doing something about the pandemic, to a how agenda, like the Paris Declaration, like the Busan Partnership, where actually the way we work together as EU and member states could be done differently. Now the jury is out in our paper, so to speak. Is this an actual effectiveness agenda, or is this mainly about visibility? Because we're also dealing in a situation where development policy of the EU is becoming progressively integrated into the EU's foreign policy. And here, of course, it matters too that you're visible, that you are recognized for what you're doing. And psychologically, the EU has had some type of complex where it perceives that it's not fully recognized for what it does internationally. So it always is concerned about visibility and making sure yeah, something is done on that. So let's see, what do we have when I press this? Yeah, so also it's been a very kind of inclusive agenda. Everybody can come on board in these Team Europe initiatives. It hasn't actually led to convergence of policies between the EU and the member states and some type of substantive policy changes. So in a way, those member states that are on the far end of the foreign policy spectrum were recognized in their efforts, and those member states on the development policy side of the spectrum were also included. In a way also, that might change, and they're also, it's a very iterative process because they wanted to avoid vetoes and any political momentum leaving the room at a very early stage. But now, of course, the EU has some what's next questions in this regard. Maybe I'll stop the presentation here, so you have the rest of the paper to look forward to, which we'll be submitting to a journal at some point in the near future. If you'd like to read it before we do and comment, then you're most welcome to contact me. So that's it for now, and I'm going to sit on my chair and I think become the chair also. Thank you. And I'm now going to pass the floor to Lena, my colleague over there, who came from Bonn by train this morning and arrived here on time to present the next paper to you. And I think we might have to use the remote to click to the next presentation. And then yeah, the big green one.
Thank you so much, Niels. Good morning to everyone. And I'm really scared of this thing now. I hope you'll bear with me. I'm presenting a paper today called Civil Society Organizations and Managerialism on the Depoliticization of the Adaptive Management Agenda. And yeah, I should acknowledge my co-author, Dirk-Jan Koch, who is a professor at Radboud University and who can't be here with us today. So yeah, the only person who's not Eidos, I guess, here in our panel. The paper basically presents a case study of a development project that has tried to implement some adaptive elements, and I'm going to try to briefly walk you through the paper. But as I'm probably not going to be able to raise all of the important points, I'd also like to highlight that the paper has already been published in Development Policy Review earlier this year. So if you're interested, you can check it out. It's open access on the Development Policy Review website. Okay, before I start diving into the case study, I'd like to say a few words about adaptive management and civil society organizations and what the two might have to do with each other. So adaptive management, just as a short introduction, was basically introduced as a corrective to results-based management approaches, which have been the sort of gold standard in development in the past decades, and I suppose they still are. And I think the problem that practitioners and also researchers identify with results-based management is that it is quite a rigid model, quite a technical model. It basically presupposes that development change, like the change trajectory, can be engineered and planned in advance without any necessary changes in between. And this sort of, in practice, turned out to create a perverse incentive structure for practitioners to rather focus on, planned models and, focus on measurable change. So what gets managed gets measured was sort of the mantra. And this is when, sort of in the last 2 decades, I think, practitioners and researchers increasingly doubted the relevance and the applicability of this model and introduced adaptive management approaches. There are a lot of different initiatives that I sort of group under this umbrella of adaptive management, and I've just listed a few here. The Doing Development Differently manifesto that was published in 2014, I think, was a very important milestone, but there are other communities such as the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice, or PDIA, Problem-Driven Iterative Adaptation of Harvard University, and also ODI was very prominent in pushing for that agenda. Adaptive management in itself, well, of course, all of these different approaches have slightly different foci, but I think what we can say is that they're basically advocating for more flexibility in project management, for more context sensitivity, for basically having short iterations, and after each short iteration in a program, people would look at the results and the change model, would gather evidence, and would then sort of adapt to the context. But another very important point that I'd like to raise is that adaptive management also puts an emphasis on local legitimacy and power shifts. And I think this is where it becomes interesting for civil society organizations. I mean, they weren't at the forefront actually of advocating for this agenda, but at least those that I've talked to in my research were all very interested in implementing more adaptively. And I think for them it's actually quite interesting because they have been under critique for focusing too much on service delivery and not really being not close enough to the grassroots. And I think this is a way that adaptive management can address these issues by sort of politicizing these interventions more. All right, so let's dive directly into the case. So the overall research question here that we've looked at is how adaptive element or social transformative elements, as they're called in the policy framework that we've had a look at, translate into everyday project management practice, so very simple. The case that we've looked at is the Strategic Partnership Program, which ran from 2016 to 2020, which was a program entirely dedicated to support civil society organizations' lobbying and advocacy activities, quite unique, a big funding program by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which comprised of 1 billion euros. And what we found really interesting, and that's why we chose it for the case, is that it relied on a policy framework that actively advocated for social transformative elements and had these adaptive elements in it, such as letting organizations choose their own monitoring and evaluation frameworks, and very light reporting mechanisms. And I think this is what we thought would be interesting to, examine how that played out in practice. What we did is we partnered up with one of the lead partners. Of course, this very big program had a lot of lead partner organizations that in turn worked with partners in the Global South. So we partnered up with Oxfam Novib in the Netherlands and looked at them and their partners in 2 countries, in Uganda and Vietnam. And of course, you also have to consider they in turn work with country offices. The country offices work with national civil society organizations and in turn with subnational ones. So it was quite a large group of people that we had a look at. The methods, just very briefly, so the main method was interviewing. We talked to roughly 50 individuals and held 8 group discussions. We also conducted participant observations. We visited each country twice for field trips. And we also had a look at various project documents, which was very interesting to, in order to confront practitioners also with, the written version of the project as opposed to what they were telling us was happening in reality. Yeah, so jumping right to the findings. Well, before I start with all of the things that didn't work, I should probably say that flexibility in this project was very much appreciated. So I think all of our respondents actually acknowledged that the ministry did a great job in trying to provide for more flexibility, that this approach of having a strategic partnership, which meant that the ministry actively said that it's involved, also politically involved in lobbying in the program, that was very much appreciated. But, and now I'm coming to the many buts, what we also found is that actually many of the things were at odds that were happening on the ground, were at odds with the social transformative ideals that the ministry was promulgating in the policy framework. And the first one is the tendering procedure. So on the one hand, they say that civil society organizations are actors in their own right. But then again, they restrict the funding scheme to lobbying and advocacy activities, which actively excluded service delivery activities, which are actually quite important for many organizations. And also that tendering procedure, obviously, with all of the competition happening, sort of work counter that idea. The second point is that the ministry, as I said before, wanted to engage in a strategic partnership with the organizations, and literally said they want to be, they want to have a mutual relationship and mutual accountability. But in fact, if you look at how the program was implemented, at the end of the day, reporting and also the money flow was still one way. Then if we look at the lead partner level, I think that is one of the most interesting findings, is that while all of the lead partners and their partner organizations were actually giving the flexibility to sort of use their own monitoring and evaluation frameworks and their own program planning tools, this is actually what not trickled down. And there is a very simple reason for that, because if you look at Oxfam Novib, who worked, as I said, with 17 partner countries and over hundreds of organizations, for them it was simply not possible to streamline all of the different reporting formats that they might have received from potential partner organizations. I mean, there was simply one project coordinator who couldn't have handled all of this. At the same time, I should say that Oxfam Novib as a lead partner granted a lot of freedoms to their subnational partners, but they weren't always harnessed, because also these organizations obviously have their own ways of working that are established, that are standardized, and so yeah, also these freedoms were not necessarily taken up, such as concluding longer term contracts or other things that the program allowed for. Another important point is that the ministry also stressed that it wanted more informal, more closer to the grassroots organizations to be part of the program. But what in fact happened is that the risks of contracting these organizations that are often not highly professional were actually outsourced to partners in the Global South. So national CSOs that were contracting these more informal organizations were actually made fully liable for any irregularities happening with regards to the financing. And that also mirrors further inequalities within partner countries. I think what we found is that actually subnational actors were the ones that benefited the least from the inbuilt flexibility. They were the ones who were monitored most closely. Okay, I hope I still have time, jumping right to the conclusion.
2 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So what we saw is that the policy did propose and did also introduce certain freedoms, but if we look at the ministry's requirements in terms of accountability, in terms of liability, they actually remained in place. So the actual power shift that the policy framework promised with its social transformative ideals did not materialize in practice. And this is sort of the central argument that we wanted to put forward in the paper, that adaptive management can in such a way actually be interpreted in 2 different ways. On the one hand side, you can see adaptive management as an agenda for shifting the power to local decision makers. But on the other hand side, you could also see it as an agenda for changing aid administration. And I think this is actually what happened in this instance, is that what we see, okay, there are a number of operational freedoms and they're all quite nice, but in fact this power shift didn't happen. And that is why we argue that the whole program was actually depoliticized in practice. And one of the major reasons why we think that happened is that all of these operational freedoms can't actually be separated from the surrounding conditions in which, and the entire ecosystem in which organizations operate. I mean, they have to streamline a lot of requirements from different donors. This is just one project or one program amongst many, which made it really hard for organizations to actually implement these flexibilities. And I'll stop here. Thank you. Looking forward to your questions.
So in the meantime, I conducted a small experiment. I noticed that actually the slides did not jump when you hold it in your hand like a small fragile bird. But don't put it on the pedestal. I think that's when it starts to jump around. Just in case some of you will be later in this room also presenting. So then I'm going to give it to my colleague Mark, who is going to start the next presentation.
Thanks. So how does it work?
The green button.
Green button, right. Okay, very good.
And keep it in your hand.
Okay, I think is someone going to dial up my presentation, or how does that
You can
work?
just go forward and then you get there.
Oh yeah, this is so under the green one, yeah. Right, yeah, very good, okay. Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks very much to Niels and to Stefan for organising the panel. Very nice to be here at Brussels Airport for this conference. So this paper is by my colleague Thilo Bodenstein, who's, I don't know what happened to the formatting, we didn't do it like that, but that's how it looks on the screen. He's a colleague who works at the Central European University, which was in Budapest. Now he got moved because of Orban to Vienna. He unfortunately can't be here today. He might be online though, so hello Thilo if you're out there. The paper's about the European donors and their aid programs in the Middle East and North Africa in the 5 years after the Arab uprisings, yeah? And the idea there is to look at whether or not there was any effort at all to actually sort of push for democratic or any sort of political change in the region, to basically support the Arab uprisings by using development aid as one of the sort of key tools for doing this. I did a similar study on the German aid program, and when we presented that to the German Development Ministry, the first question that they asked was, well, how do we compare to the other donors? Yeah, because obviously, you look bad, and maybe we're not so bad if you look at the other donors. And we actually thought that's a really good question. No one's really looked at what was really happening with the bilateral aid programs. There's been a lot of work on the EU and the neighbourhood policy and all that stuff. No one's really, and there's nothing on France. So let's take a little bit of a look at that. Yeah, and as I said, the 5 years after the Arab uprisings, that's sort of the window. I mean, as we all know what happened, 2015-16, refugee crisis and all that stuff, things got very sort of heavily securitized. So the sort of, the assumption that we've got is maybe that there was a bit of a window of opportunity for something different between those years. So let's take a little look and see what happened. We think this is important as well because, when anybody who's familiar with the Middle East and North Africa region and with the countries and with the situation in those countries will know that the pressures on the social contract which drove the Arab uprisings haven't gone away. In fact, they're probably stronger now than they have ever been. The region is still a close neighbour of Europe. And it's highly likely that we're going to be going through this process again at some point. I mean, it's a bit silly to think that things are going to stay the same as they will forever. So we think there's a sort of valid reason for looking at this question. Please don't expect anything too methodologically advanced or anything with this. We're looking at telling a story. You'll see why when we get to the data, because it's so massive that you can't really do anything other than sort of work anecdotally. But we do sort of build a bit of a framework with some standard assumptions from the aid effectiveness literature, especially things like thinking about the best approaches as being problem-driven. There should be strategic, goals should be clear, approaches step by step, these kinds of things. Coherence is better than incoherence, and collective action should drive organisation. We also use a little bit this historical institutionalism framework, so looking at decision-making processes and exogenous, endogenous shocks and how things change within these decision-making structures. And I guess our expectations from all of that are that policy will change in response to realities, but we shouldn't expect it to be optimal, and we shouldn't expect perfect outcomes. Yeah. So let's see if we can see some patterns in all of this, given all of that stuff. So we looked at the available policy documents for the European Union, for France, for the UK, and for Germany. And then we also looked at the operational level just by looking at some of the OECD DAC aid data, like overall figures, and then also in the social infrastructure and services sector, and then in the support for civil society and government sector, where we're sort of narrowing in on this democracy question. Yeah, so I mean the EU, firstly, the neighbourhood policy has evolved in a series of critical junctures since 2004. Usually events have prompted changes. It's not like the EU's particularly sort of active in that regard when things seem to be working well. The key post-Arab uprising policy documents that we looked at were the ENP revisions, which took place in 2011 and 2015. 2011 review, of course, was already starting before the uprisings, and they had to adapt it all at the last minute. And in that, you do see a lot of rhetorical support for the Arab uprising. So they reviewed the policy framework, they reprogrammed €1 billion, which they took from another pot and put in there. But by 2015, with the second review, we do see the policy framework really reflecting increasing securitization. Yeah? So, and the outcome in the end was to focus the neighbourhood policy much more on the security dimension, migration management, these kinds of things, and to reduce the EU's ambition for supporting democratic transformation. This strategy appears to be based on this idea that economic growth should be supported as the basis of political transformation. Which I guess is based on a diagnosis that the region's problems are basically economic. And of course, as we all know, it's more about politics than economics in this region, I think. The EU's approach in the end tended to match the authoritarian regime's survival strategies, particularly in countries like Jordan and Morocco, but also in other places in the end as well. If we look at France, there's a complex history with the MENA region, of course, with the French. A lot of interdependence economically, politically, and in terms of movement of people, migration as well. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that the Arab uprisings did come as a shock, a surprise to the French political establishment. There's a couple of key documents here where you can look at their motivations regarding development policy. There's a French white paper on foreign and European policy from 2008 to 20, which reflects the French government's assessment on the eve of the Arab Spring. It talks about democratization in very general terms, and it doesn't even mention the MENA region specifically. Then you have, in 2011, the framework document Development Cooperation of French Vision, which sets out principles including human rights and the promotion of democratic governance. And then there's another document called the Assizes on Development and International Solidarity under Hollande, and this was quite interesting because it came as a result of a series of dialogues between different actors from politics, business, and civil society, and it formulated 3 priorities: promotion of democracy, rule of law and women's rights, and security. And all of these things were seen as indispensable for economic development. So it was looked the other way around from some of the way the EU were looking at it. With France, the focus on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law is visible in the policy documents, but as the situation in the region evolved, then security took on a more central role. Turning to Germany, I'm going to plagiarise Ariel Sharon. I'm very sorry about that, but I think he was right when he's talking about the EU, and he's right when he talks about Germany being a payer rather than a player, particularly in the MENA region. Germany's maintained its diplomatic, commercial development presence in the region, focusing mostly on stability, supporting stability and promoting economic cooperation. And there's been active engagement from German civil society, political party foundations, etc., but not really a strong driver of change ever. Additionally, the German system's not very good at whole-of-government approaches. Ministries reflect different constituencies. They often are headed by different political parties. Their mandates are not very clearly defined, and there are also sensitivities in the areas in which these mandates overlap. So it's quite a challenge for the Germans to come up with a really comprehensive whole-of-government approach, especially when there's political sensitivities involved. The German Development Ministry hasn't produced a policy statement since 2008 about the MENA region. They're working on another one now, which is about the 4th one they've worked on since then, so we'll have to see whether it even comes out. The main instrument there was the 400 million budget line that they rolled out under the special initiative for the MENA region in 2014. With regard to democracy, the core questions around democratic transformation are handled by the Foreign Ministry. They have a program called the Transformation Partnerships, which support constitutional and justice reform and a few other things in several MENA countries. But these aren't closely coordinated with the Development Ministry's regional programs. Germany you can say they've oscillated. I think there's certainly a feeling that there's a historical opportunity for Germany there, but there's also been a reluctance to sort of step up and take it. I mean, there are a lot of reasons for that. The UK, perfidious Albion. MENA interests traditionally defined by 3 things: security, trade, and values. Security, of course, is this idea that conflicts can affect British security. Trade interests centred around hydrocarbons, but also around arms exports and these kinds of things. Values are definitely, I think I saw them described somewhere as a third wheel, yeah? So nice to have, pursue them when there's an opportunity to do so, but in general, they take a second-ranked position to security and economic interests. Nevertheless, with regard to the aid program, they've published several papers on the region since 2011. Their operational plan talks about wanting to push for a prosperous, stable region based on open democratic societies. There's an Arab Partnership Program approach, which was a joint, very different from the Germans. It was a joint Foreign Office and DFID approach to the Arab Spring, with priority areas including political participation, public voice, and these kinds of things. I don't know what's happened to that slide, but anyway, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, cool. I mean, the UK, in terms of their aid program, they're traditionally a leading actor intellectually as well as in terms of effectiveness. And I think you see this actually with regard to their program. It's probably the most well-developed of all of them. So in my 2 minutes, I'm going to be very quickly on a couple of slides. This one shows the overall aid data figures, and you can see that they all increased. The Germans way more than all of the others, but they all reacted to the events in the regions. Now we get to the squiggly slides. Yeah, here we go, squiggly slides. So these are made by my co-author. So if you don't understand them, you've got to talk to him about it. Basically what we're doing is showing the breakdown, the country breakdown of aid spending of the 4 donors. The idea is to show the trends, yeah? And the figures on the right are the overall figures. So you get a bit of a comparison between the donors by looking at the figures on the right, but I think the important thing is to show the trends. Some highlights. You can see Egypt received big increases after 2011, but they dropped off after the coup in 2013. So this may indicate at least an initial support for democracy, but of course we know it didn't stay like that. Support for Tunisia is strong across all of the donors, which indicates willingness to support the transition process. Morocco is interesting, by far the biggest partner for France, but also for the EU and Germany as well. But we're probably not talking about democracy support in the case of Morocco. And I mean, you know, the secret is that most of that aid was in the form of ODA-eligible loans for renewable energy infrastructure. Syria as well, a lot of that was EU, Germany, UK, and that's mostly humanitarian aid delivered by by UN agencies. I'm going to skip that one and go straight to the last bit because I haven't got time. So this one here is breaking down the aid a bit further. It's about as close as we can get to support for political change with the aid for government and civil society sector. Again, we see Tunisia receiving across-the-board increases. We see that France has maybe discovered this subsector, at least with regard to the Levant countries. We see that the UK has spent a large proportion of its aid to Syria in the sector, 239 million out of the overall 250 million it's spent in Syria. This is where we're at the point where we're not finished with the paper because we have to dig into these figures even a bit further to really sort of make sense of it, and this is the next step for us. But we already think there's a few interesting stories there. So just to come to our very tentative conclusions. Warning, at the moment they're not very surprising. Hopefully our conclusions will get more surprising once we get deeper into that data. But we do see an initial impulse across Europe to respond to the Arab uprisings by supporting political and economic change with aid. Yeah? Aid was seen as a key instrument. There were changes made to aid programs. But no European donor, with the possible exception of the UK, advanced a clear strategy which defined the change they wanted and defined the role of aid in relation to other policy tools in getting it. And this led to a very ad hoc and patchwork response, a mess basically. There was very little European-level strategizing and coordination on this. Windows of opportunity to exercise influence were either missed or they were misinterpreted with pretty disastrous consequences, and I'm thinking about Libya in that regard. Security and anti-migration agendas were already high on European agendas, and they were already shaping aid policies before the Arab uprisings. What we see, though, is when the Arab uprisings ran into resistance, the externalities of conflict, particularly migration and terrorism, came to be seen as threats to Europe, and this really did start to affect aid programs. But in general, I think we can say that, and this is the unsurprising part, that faced with uncertainty, European actors chose to use their aid not to support change, but rather to maintain the status quo, and I think they missed an opportunity on that. So thanks very much for listening.
There is a flash drive in one of these computers, please. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Before I do anything, I want to acknowledge my co-author, Hayatullah Jawad, who is joining us. Hayatullah. Impossible to do this kind of research if it weren't the team. So I really want to express my gratitude to everything you've done for this research. And in a sense, I'm the wrong person to present it because really it should be you. It seems that, did you click? Thank you so much. So this research is, again, a review, a critical review of a bilateral development effort, again, by Germany, and here specifically with a focus on Germany's assistance to supporting civil society in Afghanistan between 2011 and 2021. I'm not going to spend much time, if any, on the larger context because I think it's certainly most valuable to Hayatullah and me to receive your feedback on some of our preliminary findings and how we make sense of those. So we're going to go forward quite quickly. Click, please. Thank you. Just by way of a little bit of context and background, the OECD published in 2009 a very detailed study covering 6 fragile states, including Afghanistan, entitled Do No Harm. And again, you see here that Hayatullah's and my emphasis is on the fact that this came out in 2009 and already had a lot of in-depth research on Afghanistan. And we've taken 3 sound bites from this study, and I'm going to give you time to read through each of the 3 rather than reading them out to you. Can we go back, please? Thank you. So the first one is about the equation of civil society with NGOs. The second one is about the neglect or the disrecognition of the diversity of non-state actors and the resulting limitations to legitimacy of civil society support. And the third one is really kind of a misconception between what society and what civil society is. I'm going to say it one last time. This was in 2009. Click, please. So 13 years later, the German weekly Die Zeit, one of the most read weeklies in Germany, published a scathing news feature article entitled Our Mistakes. In Afghanistan, it was also German development aid that failed. So there's clearly a public interest in governmental accountability, and I think, it's very important to keep in mind that this is Afghanistan, and there are multiple donors involved. This is clearly one of the most challenging, fragile situations that the world has been dealing with in the last 20 or so years. And at the same time, in 2009, there was ample policy advice, not only, but certainly also by the OECD, on how to go about civil society support if donors want to do no harm. Click, please. So the objectives of our research are twofold. First, to amplify and learn from partners' experiences in Afghanistan in terms of Germany's civil society support, and then also hopefully to inform 2 ongoing official investigations, of which this research is not part, and deliberately not part, that will be released in 2024. And we have a lot of research foci, click, that I'm not going to go through in any depth because I think it's probably of most interest to the room to see some of the findings that we have. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of, click, of our data that we're using for this research, we are analyzing the only existing official government policy on civil society support from Germany that was issued in 2014. So about 1/3 through the period that we're covering in our research from 2011 to 2021. So in 2014, BMZ, the German Development Cooperation Ministry, published Reliable Partnership in Times of Change, New Country Strategy for Afghanistan, and it has an extensive chapter and a half really, on civil society support. So we did a very in-depth analysis of that document. We also have, thanks to Hayatullah's participation in the research, notes from participant observation throughout the entire 10.5 years. And we're in the midst of doing a total of 27 interviews with the representatives of Afghan partner organizations. In Afghanistan, about 1/3 of them are not in Afghanistan at the moment. The others are still in Afghanistan or continue in Afghanistan. We're using a structured questionnaire. As I hope you would expect from us for ethical reasons, we have an extremely fine-grained subject protection protocol because we're talking to people in Afghanistan about their experiences with one of the key donors in the country prior to the return of the Taliban. So click, thank you. We would love to, of course, randomize our data collection, but that's not possible. So we're focusing on the areas where German civil society support was most pronounced. We are going for diversity in our data. That is, we include both larger and smaller Afghan civil society organizations. We include multiple sectors, not just the 3 that we're mentioning on the slides here, but I think a total of 7 or 8, depending on how you cluster them. We importantly go beyond Kabul. 3/4 of our representatives that we interview are not based in Kabul. And as you can see, we have 3 urban areas and 1 rural area in Balkh province. So 10 takeaways, click, thank you. 10 takeaways that we'd like to share with you. And I'm going to go through the 10, and unfortunately for each of the 10, I need someone to click for the color to change. Thank you very much. So the first one we see from our document analysis is that the theories of change that the German document uses did not account for the social, cultural, and political complexities in Afghanistan. That was quite disappointing, not least because Germany has a long, decade-long involvement in Afghanistan, and certainly there's no scarcity of country expertise, which was apparently not really sourced when this 2014 strategy was developed. Click. Second, civil society organizations were seen and were in fact in most cases used as service providers. So not as political actors, and that continued throughout the engagement up until 2021. Third, the policies that we reviewed were insufficiently cognizant of civil society organizations' eligibility, of their capacity and their reliability. Fourth, we could not find any traces of a strategic needs assessment of Afghan civil societies, so the question really is, how then did selection take place? And what our interviews are telling us, that it was mostly haphazard. Whoever had the verbal access, the interpersonal access to German representatives of various organizations and sold her or himself or their organization reasonably effectively was in, and then stayed largely in. Fifth, we heard time and again, are hearing, continuing to hear time and again, that German federal accountability requirements were seen as inefficient, very cumbersome, extremely time-intensive, but also as ineffective, because they were essentially asking the recipients of German civil society support to collect and document processes which were not actually useful to capture the scale and scope of corruption that was continuously ongoing, and on which our respondents are speaking quite openly. Click to 6. Kabul-based NGOs, so not just civil society or not actually primarily civil society organizations, but Kabul-based NGOs with easier access to funding clearly had an easier task in terms of becoming recipients of German bilateral support. Seventh, we see a similar pattern beyond the capital city, Kabul. We also see it in Kunduz and in Mazar-e-Sharif. Click to 8. We do see a strong path dependency, I've already mentioned it, and a resulting hyperfocus. So a handful of organizations that kept repeatedly receiving funding by the German government, simply because we presume, or that's what the data seem to suggest, of lower transaction costs. You know, we have our Rolodex, right? And so we call the same people, and surely they can also do X when they have already done Y. Ninth, informal organizations and informal networks were largely excluded, mainly apparently not because of conceptual, ideological, or theory of change-based rationales, but mainly because they could not comply, or maybe even more so, they were seen to not be able to comply with the reporting requirements. And so there was kind of a drive towards formalization and bureaucratization of civil society, which I think resonates very strongly with points that Lena has made, with observations that Mark and his co-author have made. So the result that we are hearing in our interviews is a co-production by the German development assistance to Afghan civil society during this decade, the co-production of a corporatized, outward-facing civil society with a brittle, if any, societal basis. So last slide from us, click, and thank you very much for all the clicking. 3 points that we are currently grappling with. The first one is that we believe that the data that we have so far analyzed show that civil society organizations in Afghanistan remained ineffective at state building, even though that is supposedly conceptually and also normatively their main contribution that they can make. They remained ineffective at state building because they were not proffered politically, and instead they were used as service provided. And that rendered them baseless as constructive partners, because they were not used as political mobilizers, but rather as the users of German bilateral money that has been pumped into civil society at an ever-increasing pace. Second, the practice of German civil society support seems to really appear antithetical to years of assurances by Germany, but also many other Western donors, of supporting an anti-corruption agenda in Afghanistan. So the spending pressure, the primacy of channeling funds to already known city-based NGOs clearly seem to have had practical, de facto priority over effective due diligence, even though, of course, the statements that we were able to collect and analyze all affirm to the opposite. And last, sites with predominantly informal local governance institutions that were, because of this practice, because of this de facto approach, were to only a minuscule extent benefiting from German civil society support, eventually turned at a much higher rate to petri dishes for anti-government forces, mostly through capture, but also in some cases through collusion. And I want to leave you with that thought, because as social scientists, we do care about causality. So the question really here is the strength of causality. We believe that there is some causal relationship between the neglect, because of the practice that Ayatollah and I are documenting in our paper, because of the neglect of informal organizations, small-scale organizations, networks, and most of all clerics, on the one hand, the fact that those really dominate local governance in rural areas, and the fact that this is where the Taliban eventually, within a few months, were able to reestablish themselves. The strength of that causation is something that we wish at this point not to comment on, because we're still, as I said, continuing our data collection. We certainly don't want to come to conclusions that will eventually not be tenable. But thank you very much, and we look forward to the discussion.
You've just earned yourself a seat on the podium. So we've completed the presentations of the 5 papers. We've got 20 minutes left. I'm grateful to my colleagues that they actually kept those 10 minutes, and I could control the time by looking at my phone or at them at times, but that went very smoothly, so thanks all for that. We're happy to hear your questions, and otherwise exchange with you on the topics raised. I see Tofik over there. There's probably someone with a microphone. Yeah, there you are. And then the microphone can stay near afterwards. Maybe we take 2 or 3 questions and then see if there's time for a second round, but also if there are any questions also online in the WebEx group.
Hello? Is it on? Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, I didn't expect to be first. Thanks a lot for the session and the panel. It shows clearly, how contentious, I guess, Team Europe and everything else is also within. I just have a few questions. The first is to Jonas and Lisa. Because, thanks once again for your presentation and for this research. As the objective was also to look at what the knowledge is and how is it transferred, I was wondering, and because you mentioned power, whether the modalities of knowledge transfer also account for the different power dynamics between the organizations. If we take their capacities, for instance, but also, somehow linking back to the academic literature about knowledge, if we look at Easterly, he also talked about the authoritarian rule of experts and everything else. So that whether you take knowledge as a neutral phenomenon, or rather you problematize it or try to see how knowledge is perceived by different partners. And that could also link to what you mentioned. I think there were some notes about sustainability and the other aspects, whether there is a similar understanding of these terms by different actors, and how could we actually learn from that. Then quickly jump to the paper by Svea and Niels and Ina. Just out of the curiosity, whether is there any of your reflections on the role of the Team Europe, for instance, could take, if we talk about the Marshall Plan, with rebuilding in Ukraine and everything else, and what kind of issues or possibilities are there? For other papers also many thanks, but then I guess I have just a few clarifying questions to the paper by Daniel and Hayatullah. The first was that if you, in the paper itself, could a bit reflect more on what the civil society is, if we talk about not just the, definition that you provided in the documents that are for now, very much from the side of the Germany, but also what the civil society means and civil society organizations in the Afghan context. Also, what this was mentioned, I think the last part you mentioned about the ineffectiveness of civil society organizations in state building. But then I was wondering that from one side, it's a bit of a positivist statement. Is this the objective of civil society organizations? Is their end goal the state building? Can we assess this as effective or ineffective? And about the local authorities and governments as well, your observation was interesting because this also links back to the same institutions, maybe, I'm sure beyond Afghanistan, for instance, if we take Central Asia, you also have their quite strong role of local councils or like local governments in general. However, they do not per se, undermine the central government. They do, in a way, serve as an arm for the central government to deliver the messages, but maybe refine them with the context. If you could a bit reflect on that. Thanks a lot for all other presenters as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Very short question for the Afghan team, the paper from Daniel and Hatullah. My question is that when you looked into these interventions in Afghanistan, who designed these interventions? Please note that I'm not talking about the project because there must be some project design from the HQ from Germany that we understand. But when you design the activities on the ground, you can actually use the civil societies and give them freedom so that they can design their own interventions according to the ground realities. Because you said that they were treated or taken as a service provider, so when you use that word, we usually think that you have designed the interventions, someone is only delivering according to that. So I just wanted to know about this thing. And in addition to that, I know you have looked into only the German aid, but what about other, I think, IDPs? Did they do anything differently that was more useful or less useful? So any comparative thoughts in that area that you may take? Because we know we had a huge investment in Afghanistan, and we can have our own political prism to look into its success or failure or anything, but wanted to know in a bit of comparisons. Thank you.
And as the microphone is moving to the back of the room over there, I can already answer one of the questions raised on Team Europe and Ukraine. There have been discussions on whether there should be a Team Europe initiative for Ukraine, but it's difficult to conceive of that sort of thing during an active conflict. So it does seem to work better with member states that have ongoing projects that can be packaged in such initiative. And at the moment, of course, lots of the energy in the EU is going to discussing further macro-financial support to be given to the Ukrainian government, which is in all kinds of dire straits on the financial side of things. So that's where the current discussion is going. And of course, you can consider that Team Europe, that the EU has taken the step to jointly procure military equipment. But of course, that's not a development policy case of Team Europe. That's something rather different.
Hi, my name's Pam White. I'm here from Finland. I could just actually make a very short addition to that Ukraine thing that I'm from a consulting company and we're actually implementing a project with Finnish funds that now the EU has joined in with delegated funding in Ukraine in education. So there's a little bit of the Team Finland happening. But my question was about the adaptive management. I was listening online to that presentation and you seem to be saying that there's not results in political control, but was there much change in the aid effectiveness where there was adaptive management applied? I mean, coming from the cold face, we find dealing with development partners who are very fixated on results frameworks, no matter what happens, is a lot harder to deal with because you're wasting money basically if you continue to stick to that. So dealing with development partners who've allowed us to modify as we go along is much more effective use of the development funds, at least. Thanks.
Can you hold that question for a bit longer, Nilima? And then there are quite a few in the room at the moment. I think there was actually a microphone lying around on the stage somewhere. It's under my chair, of course.
Check. Yes.
So maybe we can take your question first, and then Lena, and then it goes to Daniel, if I recall them all correctly.
All right, thanks for the question. I'm going to answer to the first part, where the modalities account for power dynamics. And yes, of course, we don't take knowledge as a neutral term. Power dynamics are just always there in reality. There are always hierarchies and asymmetries, and it is best if organizations take this into account first when deciding on several possible modalities. So different modalities and formats are more open or closed, but in the end, it's also always a question of the way a modality is realized. And it can be about very simple things, whether there is full translation for all participants for the possibility to contribute on eye level. So these are the very detailed questions in the end then.
And your second question related to whether there were differentiated understandings of those development dimension or effectiveness dimension we showed in regards to knowledge cooperation, and yes, there are. And that's also why we wanted to bring together actors from the Global South and North, because the discussions on effectiveness have often been separated, and by bringing them together, we also feel like making a contribution of creating a common understanding of what effectiveness in knowledge cooperation can actually mean.
Yes, thanks for this question on aid effectiveness. Well, I do have to admit that I probably can't give a very qualified answer on this because there weren't any comparative evaluations. So there was an evaluation conducted on the entire program, but which had only a few selected countries which it focused on, and it was mainly about the partnership structure and relationships in the Global South between the different partner organizations that I've already alluded to. But I would, on a personal level, I would totally agree with you that there should technically be more aid effectiveness if organizations are allowed to modify as they go along. But the question is how to actually measure that change, and how to communicate it in such a manner that it's convincing. I think, many of the civil society organizations, they go with qualitative methods such as outcome mapping or so. But depending on the donor, of course, some of them would really like to see more quantitative indicators. And I think that often brings us into a situation where we just simply count, workshop participants or count, the number of, books bought or whatever, stuff that doesn't really tell anything about actual impact. And I mean, we've had this discussion for a very long time, but unfortunately, I think it is actually still true. With that being said, I think what has developed also over time in the program that I've done research on is that with regards to measuring policy, changes in policies, changes in legislation, I think there are better approaches for measuring these types of, soft outcomes and also tracking them over time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I took note of 5 questions, and then I'll hand it over to Hayatullah because he can probably answer all 5, or at least some of them. What and who is civil society in Afghanistan? The comment about ineffectiveness in state building, is this even the objective of civil society? What's the role of local government and national governance in state building? Who designed these interventions? To what extent were local actors involved in that process? And what's the comparative perspective? What about other donors? No, I did not.
I'm not talking about involvement. I'm talking about who design. Civil society can design involving the IDPs.
Right.
IDPs designing them involving civil societies are 2 completely different worlds. So who was in charge?
With that, I'll hand over to Hayatullah. That's great. I get to repeat the questions and then I can hand on for the answers. We should do this more often, Hayatullah.
Thank you very much. I'm standing I feel better when I'm standing for talking. Okay. First of all, the civil society concept within the Afghanistan framework is kind of still not fixed. It doesn't have a fixed definitions, but within this general understanding and definition of the civil society, we have different local, very effective organizations at the very grassroots that they could be very much effective in support of this general concept and making the government always accountable and responsible towards the society. But those those organizations are simply ignored in the overall process of supporting civil society organizations, and only the officially registered NGOs are considered as a civil society in Afghanistan, and those NGOs never refer to those local organizations and start a kind of cooperation to take them on board and make a kind of social basis for the organizations that are receiving funds and effectively support the policies and improve the situation. And in terms of the goal of the civil society, of course the goal of the civil society is having a accountable government in the process of state building in post-war countries like Afghanistan. When we are in the process of state building, one of the key players of the civil society who are overlooking as a watchdogs and see the policies, whether they are right or wrong, and they are effective or not effective, and they are responding to the needs of the society. But what happened in Afghanistan is usually the civil society organizations became the partners for the government, partners for the international organizations for service provision, and it had two negative effects. First, they simply took away from their own role, for their real role, and the second was weakening the government. Simply, people didn't see the face of the government for years because the service was provided by local NGOs through the international organizations, and this was the very serious negative effects that this process had for Afghanistan. And regarding your question, the design was actually after 2001 in Afghanistan, we didn't have well capacity. I mean, everything was collapsed, everything was destroyed during the civil war, and for that reason, we had everything designed from outside. The international organizations who wanted to do something in Afghanistan, they were designing their policies and taking and selecting NGOs and organizations to work with them. And this practice simply continued until 2021. So even in the developing the German strategy, which I was participating, I was, I think, with a few other NGOs, was participating to this process. I didn't see myself as much effective that I wanted to be, because everything was simply drafted and without in-depth studies of the situation in Afghanistan, as we already, Daniel already presented in the presentation. And the concept of Afghanistan was not really understood in this process, particularly focusing on the civil society issue. And actually, Germany was not alone in this process. The other countries, other big donors, was also somehow following the same way and method, unfortunately. And one of the reasons that we simply lost was this, that we couldn't really talk the people on board, the civil society on board, and the people couldn't be simply mobilized by the effective civil society organizations to be key actors in the overall process of state building. Thank you.
You can pass the microphone over there to Nilima. I had a quick look at the WebEx feed. There don't seem to be any questions there at the moment. If I'm wrong, please type it in the chat, and we'll get to you later, but otherwise, go right ahead.
Thanks, Niels, and thanks for a great set of papers. The title of the session was called Promoting Collective Action in a Post-Aid Effectiveness World. And the sense I get, sort of taking a step back from each of the papers, and the way I would describe it is maybe as a missed opportunity or missed opportunities in a post-aid effectiveness world. And I guess I have a reflection or a question, kind of a general comment maybe more. Are those missed opportunities derivative from the lack of political support for the aid effectiveness principles, or the development effectiveness principles, let's say, after 2011? Or is it something else? And the exception perhaps is the Team Europe study, where perhaps the success there derives from the fact that Team Europe and the Global Gateway are framed really as more geostrategic, driven by geostrategic imperatives. So does collective action need an enemy, so to speak? Does it to actually work in a post-aid world? Or are these papers a broader commentary on the failure of the post-development effectiveness architecture, post-aid effectiveness architecture? Thanks.
So was there any further question, or? Oh, yeah, Nadia. Yeah. Or maybe even her neighbor who is considering.
Also more a general reflection. When I was listening to all of the papers, excellent papers, by the way, presentations, I thought surfaced, and it was the more things change, the more they stay the same, in a way. And I was just wondering whether we are all addicted to bad news or something, because I was just reflecting that over the last 15 years doing research on development cooperation, I have never written a happy paper. It has always been some disillusion or disappointment, but I think I have found a positive one, and I was a little bit inspired by the adaptive management paper. Recently, I did have a very positive experience with adaptive management, where there was flexible funding, and it was process-oriented, not goal-oriented. It was all in terms of decolonizing development cooperation. So there is hope, I think. But I also feel sometimes that when a funder gives this flexibility, that it's the organizations receiving the money that start imposing all kinds of accountability mechanism upon the partners, because in the end, they're accountable, and they're actually outsourcing not just the risk, but also all the requirements plus, just in case. So maybe you have some comments on that too.
No problem. Hi, I'm Heather. Thank you for all the papers. They were really great and provocative, if sad. My question is inspired by Daniel's presentation, though I welcome anyone to answer it. And you had sort of tantalizingly at the beginning suggested you were going to do some definitional work about country ownership. And at least what you presented sounds like it problematizes both the country and the ownership, as well as the two words put together. So I was wondering if you had anything else to say on that, and possibly as we see, at least with USAID, moving into its localization agenda, given the kind of experience of which NGOs get selected and whatever, if you might have a couple words of caution or thoughts about how we could make that agenda actually live up to its promise. So
thank you. We'll stop it there then, and I'm going to pass the floor to my colleagues in a sec, maybe on Nilima's questions or reflections, two of my own. I guess the aid effectiveness agenda started off as an aid ineffectiveness agenda. There were lots of things that we were doing that looked very bad, and we had this agenda to look less bad, and we were also concerned about how we were looking towards one another. That doesn't seem to be the case today. We seem to be a bit more confident about the way we are working, which ironically is basically pretty much the baseline situation that the aid effectiveness agenda was moving away from. And I think the other point too is that development policy today needs to be effective at more things, as opposed to in 2005. There has been an expansion of official objectives, and some of these they invite collective action, but others, thinking of, for instance, getting your companies to other parts of the world, they probably are not so logically combined with the idea of doing things together. So I think that's at least one or two pieces from a much larger puzzle, I guess, on that. So then, I guess, Daniel, your paper was also referred to. Lena, maybe in opposite order, because that's how they were raised. So Lena first.
Yes, thanks. Well, yes, I totally agree that it's more of a pessimistic outlook, and I think one of the papers that I was really intrigued by that I cite in this article that I've presented here is Stephen Brown's article on the decline of the norms of the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness, and I think this is really what puts it together very nicely. You know, that there is still these vested interests out there. Which make it very difficult for reforms to sustain. And I think this is what we have tried to show in this paper under this umbrella of managerialism, that these are just very big systems, and in order to change them, it's not easy to just, introduce, just by pulling or picking out a single instance. But if you would ask me what I think, what I've learned during this research, what I think is more positive is that actually I think when we think about civil society aid, that less is often more. I think the best results that I have seen in this research is really the changes coming from very small, very informal organizations that have very little funding, that spend a lot less also on administrative overheads. And I mean, I don't want to romanticize this, because this is part of the problem. That they don't have access to bigger funding opportunities, but on the other hand side, I think sometimes it's really about involving the right organizations and investing more into coalition building and funding a more diverse set of civil society actors as opposed to always working with the usual suspects. And I think this is what Daniel's presentation is also mirrored. Thanks.
Maybe I could have a little go at Nima's question with regard to the MENA region. Collective action, missed opportunities, a lack of political support for development effectiveness principles. I mean, definitely that's the case. I think it's also interesting, though, that the aid system appears to be kind of like complicit in that as well. So there's not a lot of fighting going on from the in the sort of aid community to sort of to really sort of push its case in terms of the the political interests and foreign policy of countries. And I mean, I think this is actually a reflection of where aid and development cooperation sits in the sort of hierarchy of political issues and interests in Western donor countries. Actually, I mean. You see this, I think, pretty clearly with regard to what we were talking about. I mean, you see this initial support for democracy, pretty half-hearted on the part of the aid business, and then when the sort of threat perception, which is often magnified by far right and by the media and all of these kind of things, once this becomes a real political consideration, I mean, in Germany, for example, the AfD starts to increase its polling, and all of a sudden, aid becomes a topic which we're talking about as only something which is useful for managing migration. Yeah. Very difficult for the aid business to sort of maintain its position in that kind of a system and that kind of a structure. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is a political decision-making process which is aimed at improving the lives of people in other countries, yeah, and that's not the same. It's not as strong in a Western development, in a Western political decision-making system as the interests of strong groups in our own countries, so to say. So it's a very difficult one, but we should try to identify it and point it out where it's taking place. Definitely, yeah.
Thank you so much. Final thoughts. Okay. Well, my final thought really is that I'm really grateful for these wonderful questions. You're a fantastic audience. It's wonderful. I think Lena actually gave an answer, in a sense, to the USAID question that I don't think I can top. I think less money, because volume of aid comes with enormous administrative transaction costs. And in a different project that I'm involved in at IDOS, we see how the typical career bureaucrats at at Germany's main ministry in development cooperation typically manages between 50 and 80 projects and says very clearly that that's just totally untenable and that they spend on average 6 hours per year reviewing the progress or non-progress of each project. So less money is the way to go, much more time to study in depth who you partner with, on what, and maybe the most daring recommendation would be to take risks. And you can probably tell by my fake American accent that I spend a lot of time on the other side of the pond. And I really do think with the dissolution of DFID, USAID is now the agency to really watch. There's been a lot of progress in the right direction, and I'm saying this as a proud European. But I really think USAID has taken a lot of initiatives, and I think the question really is, are they doing what they say they're doing? Final thought is I totally empathize with the comment that for the past 15 years we've all been doing fairly depressing research. And so I think there's also a positive takeaway, which is that we really seem to have, as a community, we seem to really have understood what this is all about and what the problems are. One of the most influential scholars in my life, Teddy Brett at London School of Economics, taught me that when you take a political economy perspective at a problem, the right question to ask is not, why is this not working? But for whom is this working, and why is it therefore stable? And I would say the biggest trade-off is between really embracing the aid effectiveness agenda as it has been envisioned, as we all know how it should be working, on the one hand, or on the other hand, continuing to pump money for political visibility and leverage into countries where the priorities, the peculiarities are not fully understood or are deliberately ignored.
I thank you all for coming, and I wish you an effective lunch. See you later.